For me, the scariest thing about the backrooms isn't the entity. It's the possibility that the entity isn't separate from the backrooms at all. That this endless maze of rooms, carpet and concrete might actually behave like a living system itself. And biologically, that idea is less impossible than you might think. The backroom started as a single Tumblr post, an image of a strange, empty office space with a caption describing an endless, yellow, liminal environment you could accidentally no-clip or glitch into. That idea spread quickly online, evolving into internet lore. Kane Pixels series is now the most well-known version, set in the 1990s, following a company called Async that opens access to this infinite space. People get lost, people disappear, and over time, we start to see signs that something else is there. There's also a film adaptation coming out on the 29th of May, which is part of why I wanted to look at this now. Being a science nerd and liminal spaces fan, I think there's a really interesting question underneath the horror. If this place existed, what kind of biology would it support? And I think that question gets much more unsettling the more seriously you take it. So I'm taking you on a tour to discover the scientific possibilities of life in the backrooms. Disclaimer 1, we will have spoilers here, so if you haven't already, please go check out Kane's channel. He is so incredibly talented. And disclaimer 2, I've done my best to make this a well-rounded video with genuine scientific evidence, but there are so many things I could flesh out more in a future video. So please comment any thoughts or questions below. First, let's ignore the monster, the entity, or whatever you want to call it for a second, and look at the environment. Kane Pixels Backrooms are a really specific ecological niche. They're enclosed, repetitive, artificial, and often damp. The light is artificial and probably useless to anything plant-like. The airflow seems terrible. Surfaces dominate everything: carpets, drywall, ceiling tiles, pipes, and concrete. There is little to no food, and yet, whenever humans enter the space, it never feels sterile. It feels stale and moldy. Well, research on microbiomes in the built environment consistently show that empty indoor spaces are not microbiologically empty at all. Indoor microbial communities thrive with different ventilation, moisture, building materials, human occupancy, and dust levels. Damp indoor spaces are strongly associated with mold and microbial contamination, and exposure to these things is linked to respiratory symptoms like coughing or wheezing, which we do see throughout the series.
I'm gonna take a moment. Grab it hold it. Okay.
So, before we ask what the entity is, we can already conclude. If the backrooms existed, it would not stay biologically inactive. Even without a monster, it would almost certainly develop a microbiome. Now, what kind of monster would that microbiome breed? I think the easiest way to approach that is by the process of elimination. Could the entity be an animal? Very unlikely, in any conventional sense anyway. Large animals require reliable energy. Predators require prey. Scavengers require a sustainable input of carcasses. And although we know people die in the backrooms, occasional lost humans are not enough to support a stable population of large, mobile organisms unless there's a much bigger food web hidden off screen. The environment favors opportunists, solo breeders, and surface colonizers, not your average vertebrate species. Could it be a plant? Also, not convincing. In the classic yellow corridors, there's no sunlight, no soil, and no reason to assume photosynthetic productivity at a scale which could sustain a massive, moving plant-like organism. There are exceptions in the law, especially the glowing green room found in Found Footage 2, where plant-like structures have grown near the crashed car, and we presume its passenger. But even there, it's uncertain if we're looking at true plants, organisms that only resemble plants, or just an environment that has some productive chemistry or energy source that the original yellow rooms do not. That leaves fungi and bacteria, which is where things become more interesting. Fungi are the obvious horror answer because fungi already feel like liminal biology. They digest externally. They network invisibly through substrates. They erupt where moisture persists. They're actually an entire horror subgenre now, thanks to parasitic fungi manipulating insect behaviour, and more recently, the plot of The Last of Us. But if we follow Kane's own clues, a purely fungal explanation is not the best fit. The series points much more directly toward bacteria. Bacteria are often imagined as simple solitary dots under a microscope, but real bacteria are much more organised than that. In Kane's autopsy report, the tissue is first described as resembling Pseudomonas fluorescens, then later revised to a mutated strain of Hay bacillus, usually meaning Bacillus subtilis. Both organisms point towards the same kind of biology: surface survival, stress tolerance, and community growth. Bacillus subtilis is a gram-positive bacteria, meaning it has a thick cell wall that gives it structural protection. It also forms endospores, dormant survival structures that allow it to withstand starvation, drying, heat, and other hostile conditions. In a place like the backrooms, where nutrients are rare and conditions are unstable, dormancy would be a massive advantage. B. subtilis is also a classic biofilm former. Biofilms are one of the most important concepts in this video because they allow bacteria to act less like isolated cells and more like organized communities. In biofilms, bacteria stick together, communicate chemically, and create protected microenvironments that help the colony survive. Pseudomonas points in a slightly different but equally interesting direction. These bacteria are gram-negative, meaning they have an outer membrane that can help them resist certain chemicals and environmental stresses. Pseudomonas aeruginosa is especially well known because it forms stubborn biofilms in places like hospitals and in chronic infections. The species named in Kane's autopsy, Pseudomonas fluorescens, is more environmental than pathogenic, but it can still colonize surfaces and form structured biofilms. This is important because biofilms change what bacteria can do. They make colonies physically persistent, harder to remove, and better protected from these hostile conditions. In Bacillus, biofilms are linked to specialized cell roles and complex colony shapes. In Pseudomonas, they contribute to survival, treatment resistance, and difficult to remove surface communities. So, whichever identification you follow, Kane's law definitely points towards surface-associated stress-tolerant bacteria that survive by forming communities. And since the backrooms is an endless built environment full of walls, carpet, pipes, damp corners, and dead bodies, what you have is essentially endless habitat. The air itself becomes a conveyor belt, carrying spores, skin cells, dust, and microbes onto new surfaces. That's why the coughing matters. If explorers keep coughing, the air may be loaded with biological particulates, mold spores, bacterial aerosols, decomposition products, meaning the environment is essentially shedding life. That leads to one of the darker possibilities in the law, which is infection or colonization. When humans enter this closed, biologically degraded space and inhale that material, their bodies become part of the system. They can carry microbes in, spread them through the space, and eventually become nutrient sources themselves. This fits Kane's autopsy imagery disturbingly well. The report describes abnormal decomposition, with some tissues decaying while others remain strangely intact. In the most conservative reading, that suggests selective microbial growth from a mutated strain of Hay bacillus, rather than just the passive rot of the body. At this point, my question was, could these bacteria, these microbes, really survive somewhere this extreme? And yes, turns out that part is not speculative at all. Deinococcus radiodurans can survive radiation and desiccation that would destroy most cells. Thermus aquaticus lives in hot springs with near boiling temperatures. And microbial communities have been found in nutrient-poor caves, surviving on limited chemical energy rather than sunlight. So the biological lesson here is that life is exceptional at exploiting gradients, niches, and opportunities. However, for that, we do need evolution. If Kane's backrooms also distort time, then that changes the equation dramatically. Obviously, time travel is not real, but evolution and mutation are. A lot of fiction treats genetic mutation as something like instant redesign, but for real evolution, you need variation, heritability, and time. If the backrooms, though, have pockets where biological processes have effectively had years, decades, or longer to iterate under extreme selection, suddenly this is not a contaminated hallway after 6 weeks. We are now talking about a closed artificial biome after a very long, poorly observed evolutionary experiment. And what would that backrooms experiment select for? Persistence, dormancy, scavenging, surface adhesion, and reactivation. That is exactly why bacillus is such a strong anchor for this theory. B. subtilis endospores are built for surviving hostile times and places, and dormancy is central to its survival, even in our world. In a place where nutrient pulses are rare and conditions are unpredictable, that matters enormously. So what, specifically, could the entity be? My best scientific answer is that the most plausible backrooms bacteria monster is not a single species and not a single body. It is a consortium or community made of bacteria, extracellular matrix, fungi, maybe some scavenged human tissue, maybe dust and carpet fibers, a bit of cellulose and mineral residues. It's a complex distributed living scaffold that sometimes accumulates enough structure to look and move like a creature. That also helps explain found footage too. In the green glowing room, we see the entity detach itself from the plant-like structures, almost as if the wall is substrate, as if the entity is not hiding against the environment. It happens to be part of it. That's consistent with a surface-grown biological structure. You just heard some of the vocalizations from the entity. It doesn't always sound human, but it always sounds close enough to trigger recognition. Wheezing, groaning, distorted vocal patterns, and eventually words. A lot of people do interpret that as intelligence or mimicry, but biologically, there may be a simpler explanation. Sound does not require language or even intention. In nature, organisms and structures can obviously produce sound through movement, pressure, airflow, and resonance. Lyrebirds, for example, can reproduce complex environmental noises, even human ones, and many animals exploit sound for survival without understanding it in a human sense. So, if the entity is a moving scaffold made of biofilm, fungal growth, air, and cavities, then sound could emerge naturally from the way that material shifts and moves. Groans, wheezes, and almost vocal noises could come from air being forced through wet organic structures or preserved anatomical spaces. So, to me, that makes the sounds disturbing for a different reason. I don't think they're evidence of a human mind trapped inside the entity, but to me it shows that it's evidence that human material has become part of the system. This is where some people have brought up maze solving and collective intelligence, and I think it's worth being precise here. The classic example of a maze-solving organism is Physarum polycephalum, a slime mold that can find efficient paths through a maze to its food. That makes it tempting to imagine the entity as something strategically navigating the backrooms. But for bacteria, which we decided is the best choice, the better word is organisation, not intelligence. Biofilms can respond to their environment through chemical signalling, specialised cell roles, and coordinated movement. Bacillus subtilis has even been observed forming vortex-like aggregates. But I wouldn't picture a bacterium exactly planning routes through the backrooms. I'd picture a distributed living network spreading, retracting, and persisting wherever conditions allow. This also fits with how the entity behaves in the series. It doesn't really track humans like a normal predator. When Marvin encounters it in pitfalls, for example, it seems tied to its original area rather than actively hunting with a clear strategy. That makes more sense if we think of it as a localized network reacting to disturbance rather than an intelligent animal chasing its prey. So, how did the entity or its ancestors get into the backrooms? The more sci-fi idea is that the backrooms replicates parts of the real world, including biological traces. If it can copy spaces imperfectly, it's possible it also copies the residues within them, including microbial life. But the most likely explanation is simple: contamination. Humans and async bring microbes in through skin, clothing, air, and equipment, seeding the environment without even realizing it. From there, natural selection takes over. And once you think of the backrooms as a kind of evolution chamber, a more unsettling idea starts to emerge. What if this isn't just a place where life survives, but something that behaves like life itself? I don't mean that literally in a canon sense for the plot, I just mean biologically. Think about the recurring patterns in Kane's series. The backrooms replicates, but imperfectly. It copies rooms and structures the way biological systems copy DNA with error. It grows by extension and repetition. It consumes people by trapping them and redistributing them into its ecology. It changes over time and has very different specific zones. In my mind, it's less like a building than a tissue made of architecture. If the entity is real within that space, then maybe it's not an invader at all. Maybe it's what happens when the backrooms finally begins producing visible organs. And that, to me, is the most interesting scientific reading of Kane Pixels Backrooms. That a strange, built environment, given contamination, selective pressure, distorted time, and enough surface area, could produce a community of life. A community of life so integrated with the place that separating organism from environment stops making sense. It's terrifying, the idea that the place itself has become biologically active, and the thing chasing you is just the part that learnt how to detach from the wall.